I know the kind of pain you're feeling, Alex. I once had it myself.
You some kind of doctor?
No, Alex. I am Magneto, and I have come to offer you sanctuary.
Welcome to Season 3 of the Grounded Futures podcast. This is the show where we discuss topics that are important to our collective survival and thrival. We also dig into ways youth, and anyone really, can gain new skills to thrive amid current and ongoing disasters. This season's meta theme is all about trust. Trust in ourselves, trust in our work and art, and trust in each other. We are your hosts, William and Carla.
Welcome to our show. We produce Grounded Futures on Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, but our guests are from around the world. A big thank you to Zach Bergman for our show music, and a big thank you to Robin Carrico for our show art.
And before we start today's show, here is a short jingle from one of our pals over at Channel Zero Network.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero Network.
Today, we are joined by Zena Sharman, a writer, speaker, strategist, and LGBTQ plus health advocate. She's the author of 3 books, including The Care We Dream Of, Liberatory, and Transformative Approaches to LGBTQ plus Health. Zena edited the Lambda Literary Award-winning anthology, The Remedy, Queer and Trans Voices on Health and Healthcare. She's also an engaging speaker who brings her passion for LGBTQ plus health to audiences of healthcare providers, students, and community members at universities and conferences across North America. Welcome to the show, Zena.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Yes, welcome. Just before we came on, you mentioned you lived down around Commercial Drive for 20 years, and I we kind of were on the peripheral of our communities together, and I always saw you at a distance because you just exude joy, and you were like, it was just, we just miss you being around in the orbit where we physically live, and it's just such a pleasure to have you here. And yeah, and you're clearly a fellow edge walker on all these ideas of trusting each other and thriving and joy. And I just think we're going to have a lot to talk about. And you also bring a wealth of knowledge and concrete information that we really want to get into and share with our listeners. So thank you so much for being here. And let's get to it.
Yeah. So you wrote about your newest book, The Care We Dream Of. At its core, this book is a spell of healing and transformation, rooted in love. I love that. Perhaps you can say more about that. And we'd love to hear about the road to this work. Like, when did you first become active in organizing in general, but around these themes? And connected, how have your ideas changed, transformed, shifted over the years, and what ideas remain and are kinetic?
Yeah, thank you so much for that rich and really layered question. And what I'll do is probably answer a few different parts of it, which are all interconnected, and also I think in some ways touch into aspects of my whole life, right? So kind of the last 40 plus years. When I conceptualized The Care We Dream Of as a spell, it's my 3rd book, and one of the things I really love about making books is you put all of this energy and effort into creating them. And the books that I create are largely anthologies or anthology-like. So they are very kind of collective and community processes. But there's so much work that I do by myself, right? Just me and my computer. And then the book goes out into the world and it does its work. And it does its work in dialogue, in community. It travels and I really wanted to be intentional about that when creating the care we dream of. And so really worked with it as a spell. I set a core intention for the book right at the very beginning of working on it. I had an altar for the book that I kept above my writing desk, and I would, every time I sat down to write, like really ground into a process of ritual in a small and light touch kind of way. And I had pictures of different queer and trans ancestors who really inspire me in this work and who I feel an accountability to as well. So when I thought about, actually naming that intention, because that's what those words came from, it felt a little bit like a phrase I've heard from some people, like the idea of coming out of the broom closet, like as a witch, and as someone who's really interested in ritual and magic, which is a big part of my life, and also can feel a little bit strange sometimes when I traverse those more conservative or normative worlds of health research, where people are so invested in particular kind of modes and forms of knowledge. So it also felt like a particular kind of queer claiming to say, yeah, this book is a spell, and it is about love, and it is about healing, and it is about transformation. And I hope not in a like white cisgender, settler lady in her 40s going around and saying like, love is love and love is the answer, but actually really richly grounded in praxis, and really thinking about what does this look like as we reckon with the forms of systemic oppression that impact and limit the life chances of so many queer and trans people, obviously with a hugely disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, trans and gender diverse folks, poor people, sex workers, people who use drugs, disabled people, all the amazing people that make up so many communities, who do experience so much harm and violence in our societies and certainly in our health system. So, that connects to, I think, maybe the longer arc of the work that I've done around health and healthcare, some of which happened formally through schooling and training, but it's always been really deeply rooted in activism and in community for me. Like I was raised by an activist single mom who did so much of that activism like at our kitchen table, and it was kind of like the kitchen was also my mom's office, and was a real space where she did a ton of organizing, particularly with other survivors of trauma and violence. And a lot of it was arts based as well. And so that was kind of the water that I was swimming in from a really young age. And the older I get, the more I realize how profoundly it shaped me and how important that kind of organizing is, and resistance against institutions. And then I did a lot of formal schooling, but always had different kinds of forms of community engagement happening on the side. And when I came out in my early 20s, it was while I was living in East Van, and I was super lucky to come out into a community of, femmes and drag queens and punks, and that was so formative and had a huge impact on me in terms of the ways that I came to understand like what it meant to be in queer community, what it meant to do activism, and I think fundamentally like how I conceptualized health and healing. So the work that I've come to do later in life has really been about like braiding all of those histories and sets of experiences together, and like working strategically, with research or systems that exist, but also so much about really understanding how do we challenge them? How do we resist them? How do we divest from them? How do we build outside of them? And how do we make all of that be so deeply rooted in community?
Yeah, that was amazing. That was a really great answer. Felt really cool. Did you want to say it?
I mean,
I'm always like, after someone answers a question, I'm always like, oh my God, that was so good. I don't know what to say.
Liam processes it for days. We talk about it around the dinner table forever. All the stuff people don't hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that it was all, you weaved a beautiful story and showed that and you can tell that that's what's in your work, that it's an embodied experience and not just an idea or a theory that's abstract and outside of yourself. And I just really appreciate, I appreciate that, that you are connected though to the actual systemic systems in terms of your work, like that you're not just prefiguring something on the side, you do both. And that's always like I just bow to that because I don't do that. So I'm really, really impressed with folks who can do that. Sorry, I got a laugh. Yeah, and it's kind of connected to my question. So, so much of your work is creating these webs of concrete care, and particularly across ages. And at the heart of it, it seems to be about queering health and kinship and the everyday act of making kin, and particularly a family that goes beyond the nuclear one. And I'd love to hear your thoughts or maybe some of your praxis around care being something that can go in all directions. Like, so i.e. a kid can provide care for the adult in their life, and or the elder, and vice versa, that it's not just somebody who's able-bodied or whatever can provide care, or somebody with wealth only provides care, and maybe, yeah, just to break that open a bit, what it means to queer health and kinship.
I mean, it makes me think about, Carla, something I read of yours, and I went back to this the other day because I wanted to remind myself what you said specifically. So, because I love to cite my sources, what I will say is this was in a piece you wrote on youth liberation and deschooling in the No Against Adult Supremacy. And so the thing that you wrote about, and that really resonated for me, was that you said that it was through the act of parenting that you have been truly radicalized. And so I really resonated with that, because something I think about a lot in my own life, like I'm 43 now. So as someone in my early 40s, when I was in my like early to mid 30s, I was like the caregiver to my mom as she was dying. And then it wasn't until I came into my late 30s that, I mean, very unexpectedly in terms of my own life trajectory, I ended up becoming a parent in the context of this queer family formation. And so I've had this experience in a relatively short window of time, in my 30s and into my 40s now, of caring for my, disabled mom as she was dying, and then becoming a parent and now parenting 3 young children. And, I've always been someone that's been rooted in activism and rooted in radical politics. And also, I feel like I've become specifically much more radicalized around what I think of broadly as intergenerational solidarities, which is also, I think, so woven through with disability justice for me. And probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I made a really intentional commitment to learning more about disability justice, as a person who in my current body mind isn't disabled. And also, I fully expect that will change in the future, because that's what happens as our bodies get older. If I'm lucky enough to keep getting really old, which I hope and dream of. Um, so I want to kind of pull those threads together, because I think that intergenerational solidarity, thinking about how that deeply entwines with disability justice, is really important for me as I think about care and kinship in practice. And in my own family life, this feels like a really rich site of learning, and maybe in a really classically, hilariously queer kind of way. I sort of accidentally dated my way into a 4-parent queer family. So there's 4 of us co-parenting together. We now have 3 kids. So we've got a 4.5-year-old, and then we have 6-month-old twins. So there's nothing like having 6-month-old twins to make you appreciate having 3 other co-parents, let me tell you. And it's been a really amazing experience. Again, like thinking about praxis, like, well, what does it mean to actually commit to creating family outside the nuclear family? And how do we share the care? How do we share the work? How do we weave together our everydays and every nights to do this kind of caring in ways that feel equitable? I think a lot about how our kids have 4 parents and no mothers. Like, none of us identify as a mom. We all have different kinds of parent names that feel right-sized for us. 2 of us in our parenting configuration, the name I kind of made up for us half jokingly is a vice parent. So we have 2 lead parents and 2 vice parents that have somewhat different kinds of roles. So I mean, I say some of those things and I can talk about them in more specific detail, but I really feel immensely grateful for getting to do that every day, every night work together. It definitely makes parenting accessible to me. Like, I was raised by a single mom, and we lived in poverty, and we were really very intentionally, my mom separated us from her family of origin, like as a really purposeful act of stopping cycles of intergenerational trauma, and so I know why she did that and why it was necessary, but I spent a lot of years really feeling like family and kinship was small and fractured, and that parenting could only ever be exhausting and overwhelming. And I saw how hard my mom worked and like what an amazing job she did under really adverse circumstances. Um, and I also spent a lot of years thinking, there's no way I can do that. I could never be needed that much. It feels so overwhelming. So I feel immensely grateful to have come into the family structure that I'm in and this different kind of kinship structure that I'm in, because I feel like it teaches me every day, like what it means to give and receive care. And some of that for sure is about like being in reciprocity with our kids, and also in a really right size way, thinking about my own experiences of having been a kid who had to do a lot of caregiving, like for the main adults in my life, and that has complex legacies for me. And so something that feels really important for me as a parent is how to support our kids to feel like they get to be kids, and that we listen to them and we respect them and we want to honor and respect their bodily autonomy and what they think, but also they don't have to be our caregivers, in ways that don't feel aligned with where they are developmentally, right? I happen to be someone who has a bunch more years of life experience than them, which doesn't mean I'm better or smarter, but it does mean I have a different job in our family.
That was amazing. Yeah, it really hits home there because of, my mom definitely dealing with, sicknesses and all of that when my childhood, and me and my brother when my dad was at work and taking care of her and stuff like that. And I definitely totally understand that. And another thing as well is the, having all these adults in your kid's life and stuff like that, your kids' lives, and how, yeah, I had like so many moms as a kid, like just other than my actual mom. It's like I had so many adults in my life that were also parenting me and taking care of me while my parents were also doing the other things they wanted to do and taking care of another kid. And it never felt like, oh, they're just throwing me off to the side though to some other because they want to do their own thing or something. It never felt like that. I had so much time with them still, but it also is really amazing that I was able to grow that kind of community with a bunch of adults in my life. So
Well, yeah, and I
that
think
was
about
great.
it in
Yeah.
the sense of like, I mean, maybe as many people of my particular ilk are, I've had
Mm-hmm.
moments of being briefly obsessed with attachment theory in all its
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
problems and complexities. And also, I mean, I love the idea of secure earned attachment, like the fact that we're not stuck in a particular kind of quote unquote sort of dysfunctional mode of attachment into adulthood, regardless of what our start was like.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I say that as someone who really feels like I've had to learn what a secure attachment feels like in adulthood, because I didn't have that in the same ways that maybe I needed when I was a littler kid. And I joke that my current partner, who's both a triple earth sign and a person who has a secure attachment style, is just like the most relaxing person I've ever been in a relationship with, because it just feels so nice. They're so sturdy. And also, I think about our kids' nervous systems, and like,
Mm-hmm.
wow, what's it like to have four attuned adults in your life caring for you, on an everyday
Mm-hmm.
basis? And because we're able to parent and care for our kids in ways where we feel more resourced, right? Like that doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean we don't get exhausted and overwhelmed sometimes. And also we have more capacity to like tap out or like pass the baton to another adult, so that our kids always have somebody who is grounded enough, is resourced enough, and like, that idea of being able to attune to them and care for them in really rich and responsive ways. And I don't know, I hope that is giving them a really solid foundation, not just in the way of like what do they experience, but also like how do their little bodies feel, and hopefully they'll have that deep sense of rootedness as they get older. Like I really wish that for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
They will. That's
Yeah,
beautiful.
that is beautiful.
Yeah, and I want to give a shout out to the queer families that were around me when I was first starting out as a parent, because I actually learned from them how to create this intentional web of of kinship for my kids beyond the home, and because they were doing it, because for lots of reasons. I think they were one of the they were on the cover of the Georgia Straight. This was like Laura Main and that crew of folks, multiple parents for their one kid, and when my eldest is autistic, and when he was like 10, Liam was born, and I really knew I needed and I had lupus. So I was like, okay.
Yeah.
So, and it was just, those are the people who showed up. And when we did a ceremony of a welcoming into the community when Liam was 6 months old, there was like 30 adults there, ranging from, 18 to
Your age.
60,
Yeah.
who said, I'm here for Liam. And they continued, like a chunk of them continued while
Yeah, even if they're not in our lives fully,
Yeah, as
like
life
they
went
would
on.
still.
Birthdays, asked to hang out. Some were blood relatives, like aunties. I too have some parallels with your mom. I cut off our family for same reasons, and so there's just lots of parallels, but it's almost like generationally just a bit different. So yeah, I think that's just beautiful, and I'm so delighted to hear. And I imagine we'll all hear more about how it goes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with that of talking about me growing up with you having lupus, since I was a kid, I was obviously deeply aware of the inevitability of death and all of that. And I think it's so important that you include that in your work about community care. I'm really glad you talk about aging and elder care and all of that. It reminds me a lot of something Dean Spade said to us about hoarding, which is a barrier to enacting mutual aid in the everyday. And it's connected to this preparing for growing old and intergenerational thriving communities. And I know you took a death doula course this past summer, and I'm curious why you took it and how it's all connected.
Thanks for asking me about death. I do love talking about death. And, it's funny. I've kind of been laughing at myself a little bit recently because I look at the care we dream of and realize just like how much page space in that book is somehow devoted to aging, death, and dying. And I knew that I was doing it while I was making the book. And also, I think in the present moment, about a year after the book has come out, I'm feeling really conscious of how I've actually been on this long trajectory of especially the last kind of 8 or so years where I've really been feeling a stronger and deeper calling around death and dying and grief work. So just to say, it's something that feels really important to me on a lot of levels. I first really started thinking maybe more formally and practically, and I guess maybe more traditionally academically about care and care work and aging when I was in grad school. Like my PhD research actually focused on the recruitment and retention of home support workers. I was really interested in what does it mean to be in a context where we have a lot of older people living in communities, disabled folks living in communities who need skilled care workers to come and care for them in their homes in order to stay in community where they want to be. And yet, we pay them so bad, we pay the workers so badly, we organize their work in such a way that it becomes physically exhausting, emotionally exhausting. It makes it just almost impossible for them to care. And I was really like preoccupied by that question as a grad student. So initially it really was a more kind of academic line of inquiry. And at the same time as I was reading all of that research, I was looking at these stories that were talking about, what does it mean to be an older single woman in Canada if you're living in poverty, and starting to feel afraid. That was in my 20s, for my mom and for my future self. And so those were some of those really kind of early seeds of really thinking about those things, but maybe in more abstract kind of terms. And then, when my mom became sicker and had a longer trajectory of sickness before she died, she was in Ontario, so I was caring for her at a distance. But it suddenly was like that experience of having all this research stuff I'd done in school really come to life. She was in her home. She was being cared for by those workers. I saw all of these things that I had studied about the system, like happening in her kitchen, in her bedroom. Like I have this mental image of that pathway from her front door to her kitchen to her room and back, which was the path that many of those workers would have trod, right? And so that was a really, I think, kind of early place where I started thinking about like, what does that look like and mean in practice? But it's really been since my mom's death in 2014 that I got really deeply into wanting to understand and learn more about and make sense of grief and death and dying, because I had been so impacted by it. And I felt so unprepared when she died. Like I didn't have anybody there really to mentor me. I was really lucky to have been held and supported by queer friends and queer community, and in particular, like older queers who had been really more deeply involved than me in the AIDS crisis, because they were probably about 10 years older. And so they had already lost a lot of loved ones during that time, and had one friend in particular who had lost a lot of family members already and kind of became a bit of a death mentor, just around the practical stuff. So, I mean, I share these details. They sound kind of maybe really concrete, but it was that experience of just like going through these massive changes and transitions in my life and like not really knowing what to do and just wanting someone to say to me, here's what you do, here's how you do this, here's how you be with death, here's how you be with grief. So it's been something I've thought a lot about, and I've kind of become a bit of an informal go-to person in my circles for peers and community members around grief and death and dying. Some of it, which is just like purely how do you navigate the bureaucracy, which is an important queer skill. And this year, I just felt a really strong kind of intuitive call to go do a death doula course, which is not the thing that I want to be my job, and also feels like a really important way I can be of service in my communities. So it was a bit of a long and rambly answer. I hope there's something useful in there. But it is, I think, the kind of question that brings so much up for me around fundamentally, it's like, how do we learn how to get old and how do we learn how to die? And how do we figure out how to embrace those inevitabilities? I mean, not that getting old is inevitable. I mean, I think that so many people don't have the opportunity to live long enough to get old, and that in and of itself is so connected to inequity and oppression and violence. And also, like, what might it look like to create the conditions for more people to get really old and for more of us to get really excited about getting really old? What might it look like to create the conditions for more people to die, not necessarily a sort of quote unquote good death, because I feel like that's sort of moralistic and narrow, but Sally Teasdale has this idea of a fitting death, which I really love. Like, how do you die in a way that fits for you, that feels right and good for you, which also feels like a really queer question for me. So I'm really interested in how do we create those conditions, and how do we create the conditions for more people to live really long and flourishing lives, really interdependently in community, which again is really entwined with disability justice too.
That was a really great answer. Yeah, that made me excited. I love talking about death and all of that kind of stuff. It's really, really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing some of your personal story around grief and dealing with grief as well. I'm really grateful. And I'm also really obsessed with this too because, well, first of all, I've like cured my lupus. So I actually really believe we can, when I said at the beginning, like, well, you're a fellow edge walker. And what I mean by that is people who like are really willing to go to the edges of things and push. So, we did it around schooling, and we've done it around parenting, rearing, and how to be thinking what a family can look like and be, and community. We started thinking about, oh my God, I might age into poverty if I don't start thinking about aging, and really weaving that into our intentionality of how we think about being in community and stuff. And it's one of the hardest boxes to break out of. Like, it's been the most challenging. We've done intentional stuff with a lot of folks who just have to, it's scary, right? Like they go by the house and they leave, or whatever. And like, no shade on them. It's real, but there's a crew of us, another single mom and a few other people who were just like, let's just do it. Let's approach it like we did the unschooling. And like all the things that other people were frustrated with us about that too. Let them be frustrated with us that we're saying, you know what, we're not going to age the way that mainstream tells us to age. We're going to create this intergenerational awesome community that
instead of the old person needing to settle down and just
Yeah.
stop. And it's like,
Yeah,
no,
with the
you want to keep
retirement
traveling, keep
or like
doing all the things.
Dean said, like, that's part of the hoarding ideology, which is what we're up against.
Well, and I think also, if you trace back the history of the modern, what we understand to be the modern nursing home or long-term care facility, it's rooted in the poorhouse, right? Like which actually was a carceral space. And there's people doing really important work, including actually the Disability Justice Network of Ontario that has an amazing campaign around abolishing long-term care. And so it's if we think about that lens of like prison industrial complex abolition and we extend that to carceral spaces of care, whether that's a long-term care facility or a nursing home, whether that's psychiatric facilities, certain, like coercive drug treatment facilities. There's so many ways in which these carceral logics and these logics of disposability or locking people up because they're quote unquote sort of somehow too much, or they can't participate in capitalism or some narrow notion of community or ability. Like that's where I think these radical possibilities, like it's really where the rubber starts to hit the road, right? So how do we think expansively about what's possible? And how do we start experimenting with this every day? And I'm just in the process of reading the brand new book, The Future is Disabled by Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarsinghe. And like, I'm such an immense fan of Leah's work and their previous book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. And I think of works like that as being such powerful documents of the kinds of possibilities that exist. Just like some of the ones I write about in my book, like the group of LGBTQ plus older adults in Amsterdam who were like, we're going to band together and make our own apartment building, with an apartment in it for a live-in caregiver for when we need one, and I love seeing those possibilities, or like the Baba Yaga house in France, right? The older women who did something similar. So I love that you're starting to do those experiments in real life and being able to think about like, what does practical interdependence look like and how do we plan for it, right? As opposed to just kind of hoping it's going to happen someday, because it takes work. And I think a lot about the idea that like some spider webs are stronger than steel, and it's because they're made of thousands of tiny strands. So I think a lot about that in terms of, again, this notion of care webs and what does it take to actually weave interdependence. And it is that thousands of tiny strands.
That's an amazing answer there. That wasn't even a question we asked, but that was really good.
Yeah, the beautiful metaphor too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that you weave in disability justice, and it's definitely an intersection that I've cared about, including mind disabilities. And it's definitely an intersection where I really, as an artist and how I create platforms, is I really think about the way that we produce and create things across working with folks who have like whatever their neurofabulousness is or whatever. And it is part of this as well. And yeah, it's just, it's all possible. And yeah, and just reading your book and stuff, I was just thinking about that work and how it's just becomes like you can really see things busting open. Like it seems to be a conversation that was always very pushed to the side. And I want you to talk about pleasure-centered healthcare. I know you discussed that in your book with, is it Dawn Sarah? I love that. Oh my gosh. Can we just have that happen always? I mean, with someone with chronic illness all my life. Yeah, I mean, I just have one traumatic experience after another. The doctors never listened to or believed. So I want pleasure-centered healthcare. Anyways, yeah, just maybe share more what that means. And do you have a working definition for the word care? I mean, when people ask me if I have a working definition for joy, I'm like a deer stuck in headlights. I'm like, no, I wrote a whole book about it.
Thank you for throwing the hot potato back to me, the definitional hot potato. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the invitation to think about pleasure-centered healthcare, and yeah, I really want to honor my conversation with the very wonderful Dawn Sarah about that. And that was really a point of entry to think about. I mean, I guess at a really basic level, like what if accessing healthcare and healthcare writ large, but I think in this case, we were especially thinking about the health system maybe more formally, because it often is a place where care might feel lousy and in some cases feels absolutely awful and violent and harmful, right? Which is certainly the experience of many people. Again, especially queer and trans folks, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, disabled folks, others. Um, so, like, what if healthcare actually felt good? What if it felt pleasurable in a really richly and fully embodied kind of way, right? And that can look a bunch of ways. When I talked about it with Dawn, she talked about things like the physical spaces. What if you got to sit in a chair that felt comfortable, for your particular body shape and size and ability? What if the place you were in smelled good to you? What if the lighting felt easeful for you? If you happen to be a person who is sighted, like just the ways it actually can become like part of almost just like the micro elements as well as the macro elements of the spaces. And then what if the conversation with your care provider, whoever that was, became about expanding into and focusing on what pleasure or feeling good like actually means for you. And I know sometimes when in our society or culture, the ones that at least I'm in, sometimes pleasure gets conflated with like sexuality or eroticism, and that can be part of it for sure. And also pleasure, I think, can be so much more expansive than that, right? It's like our sense of aliveness, our sense of feeling fully in our bodies and our minds in ways that feel really good to us, that sense of just really, really enjoying an experience. And so there's so much about accessing healthcare that is the total opposite of that. And when I've had a pleasure-centered healthcare experience, in the small places I've done it, it's always been outside the formal health system, right? Whether it's with the like tough love acupuncturist I used to see who would always tell me exactly what I needed to hear, even if I didn't want to hear it, and then would send me into like a deep state of relaxation while tucked under a cozy blanket for 45 minutes, or the amazing massage therapist I used to see regularly until we both moved away, who was just such a gifted healer, and would just let me like cry on her table while she massaged me, and held me with such care and thoughtfulness and intention in the wholeness of myself. And, I've never had that experience with a physician, right? Like in the formal health system. And I don't think that that's an accident, like something I've really reckoned with. And Liam, you asked me about this earlier, like how has my analysis changed? And I think something I really came to a lot more clarity on as I was working on the Care We Dream Of was the idea that the system isn't broken, it's working as designed. Because I think so often, and this was very much part of my like formal learning around health and healthcare, was this notion of like thinking within the constraints of the system that exists. And I see that trickle down to how we often are taught to think about queer and trans health within queer and trans communities, which is we just have to hope that they're not going to be shitty to us. And that if they are just reasonably okay and like respect our dignity and humanity and like and treat us just as a regular person, that's it. That's the pinnacle of what we can hope for, And obviously so many people don't have that experience already that we do need to get there. And what I want is for us to change the frame of what's possible, right? And so if we were to begin from pleasure, for example, that's a very different conversation than beginning from, how do we make this existing system slightly less awful, which I feel like often is maybe at least the unconscious beginning place, including in some of my own work in the past, right? And so it's really been, again, through an ongoing process, both of learning and also unlearning, that I feel like I've gotten better at figuring some of this stuff out. Not that I have it figured out, but I feel like I'm maybe like looking at and engaging with the system in a way that feels more generative to me, but I think in a way that allows me to kind of hold the system more accountable and hold myself more accountable in how I relate to that system.
Yeah, that was amazing. It really makes me think about how when I was first coming out as trans and how I was so lucky of being able to have the community around me, and I was able to go to the clinic,
Oh,
Three Bridges.
yeah, we had a trans
And
friend who helped
yeah,
like connect to the nurse that was really solid and then to the doctor who, there was a web of like, talk about
Yeah.
the spider web, just
Yeah.
this like,
Yeah.
it
And
was
I
just-
ended up getting like a doctor that was, homeschooled their kids and did not blame me being trans and all these things on the fact that I'm not in school, which so many kids end up getting against. For some reason, just blaming it on that kind of stuff. So that was really, really
that intersection is a thing.
Yeah, definitely.
I was just muted so you couldn't hear me swearing in the
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Uli was like, was thinking about some counseling, and we were asking, our community, because wanted to get a counselor that was at least connected to the queer community, if not queer themselves, but what it really actually came down to was what's their thoughts about school, really, because
That's most of it. Yeah.
like if they have a predilection towards the idea that that anything that's
Different.
outside of that
Yeah.
is actually going to be the problem, then like Uli's like, well, I'm not going to be able to work with that because it's going to start from a place of judgment against me for being an unschooler, and
yeah, they're gonna think I'm.
and this
way
is
I
the
am
school
'cause
of
of
hard
that, yeah.
knocks. I've had it happen over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Well, and it becomes a question about that provider or that person's relationship to normativity.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
And this notion, like, I mean, to me, like, I work from the fundamental premise that it is awesome to have trans people in the world, and I want more trans people and more trans children in the world. Like, that's phenomenal. It's wonderful. Bring it on, right?
Yeah.
And also, I love what you just shared because I had never thought about it before. And as soon as you said it, I was like, well, first I swore. And then I was, of course, right? And, it's been so interesting because I hadn't really thought super critically about the education system. I think partly because I was a kid who really thrived in the public school setting that I was in for a bunch of reasons. And was someone who did a lot of formal schooling, again, because it was something I enjoyed and was good at, but also because it was a trajectory out of poverty. It was, for me, a trajectory into a kind of security and stability that I didn't have access to in the context of the childhood that I had. So there's so many layers there. And also, I'm so grateful for the work, certainly that I know that you did through the CISL, Carla, and through the work of the larger unschooling movement and deschooling. And these are areas I'm really just starting to learn and think about. And what I love about it and sometimes feel overwhelmed by is as soon as I started looking at the education system as an institution, like the same way that I did the health system, I was like, oh, damn, like, of course. And it's really raising super interesting conversations with me and my co-parent as we explore possibilities for our older kid, who would be school aged next fall. And we're really looking at like, what can we do as a family to create home learning options for her? And again, actually, I want to shout out Ground of Futures because I loved the interview you did with Megan Carrico. And I actually reached out to Megan after the show, and we had such a great conversation with her that was really helpful, just I think in giving our family a little bit more of, I guess, almost that like system literacy to figure out what is possible, and how do we do that in ways that also feel really values aligned, because we don't want to just be like the white parents that just can extract our kid out of the public system, yet also we really want to do something that we hope will be something that will support her to thrive. Less of a question for our 6-month-olds right now because they're just tiny, tiny babies, but a very alive question for us with our bigger kids. So just want to express such gratitude, to both of you for the conversations you hold here, and Carla for the work that I know that you've done for a longer time span, because it really teaches me a lot and gives me, I think, a stronger sense of possibility, as well as I feel like a stronger call to action, like as an adult in solidarity with the kids in my life who I feel like I have a responsibility to make it happen.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation because it's like, my entire life I was able to grow up in that kind of around schooling and just how that looks and whatnot. And, I only ever went to an alternative school, but I also like dropped out a lot, even at the end alternative school. It's like cool alternative school that's ran by Megan Carrico, who was one of my many moms as a kid. But like it was random. It was really cool, like as a kid. But then I still would drop out. Like I would be there for maybe 2 years, and then I would drop out for a year, and then I would come back, and and just being able to, grow up in a stable household that even is allowing me to even do that. It's not just, well, either you're going to be in the alternative school or you're going to not, or be in this school or so I think it's really cool, really, really cool conversation about schooling and,
Yeah, and about like young people owning their road to, I mean, when they're really little, they need lots of support and guidance, obviously. And guidance, I mean, I still need guidance.
Yeah.
There's a great quote from Ursula K. Le Guin there where she breaks apart the difference between guidance and like and
Control.
someone telling you what to do. I think you write about this really well in the book, Trust Kids. But this importance of like, there's Trust Kids. Yeah, and just, we just always had a thing of, if you want to go to the school in the neighborhood or any kind of school, any kind of learning environment, we will work hard to help facilitate that.
Yeah, and I mean, with school, it's like, I'm also, I don't say that like, oh, school is bad, just get rid of it. I also do always think about like me not being in school, and I have those moments where I'm like, wait, why do we have school? Like, I don't need it, actually. I learned so much. I've learned so much because I actually have way more free time to learn about what I want to learn about.
Yeah.
And, but also being able to make the schools a safer place for people. I always think like students comparing it to prison, and it's like, well, why are they doing that then? Maybe work more on,
Because most kids have to go to school.
Because most kids, they're forced to go to school, and and sometimes they end up with the bad teacher, and they end up in that really controlled space. And it's figuring out ways to be able to make school a safer place for kids, because there's so many like you who thrived in that and really wanting to go to school, but there's still like so much shittiness that happens in those spaces, and seeing how that can get better. But yeah.
Yeah, that bodily control or autonomy.
Yeah.
Like when you eat, when you go to the bathroom. I mean, I can't even. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, I can go into the next question. We could talk for hours about schooling and
youth autonomy.
Yeah.
I mean, really, we're really talking about autonomy. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, I read a quote from you that said, quote, "Trans folks are often expected to embrace a narrative that makes cis people uncomfortable, something simple and linear that upholds their binary understanding of gender transition," end quote. And, it makes people comfortable.
Cis people comfortable.
Cis people, that's what I said, yeah. And yes, that has been my experience, not at home, obviously. I have a very safe home space, but in many spaces and places, especially the binary part, like it was okay that I was trans, but I had to be very masc, which isn't really me, and it sucked a lot. And since you wrote that, have you seen this getting better at all? Has the binary been busted open more? And if yes, or even if no, what are some strategies youth or folks dealing with this can arm themselves with?
I think it's such an important question in the sense of like how are we situating ourselves now in this particular gender moment, and obviously this particular gender moment is not a singular gender moment. I think it's highly contextual. Something I take a lot of heart in is looking just at even at the level of like demographic surveys, right? That we see an increasing number of people in the population who are identifying as trans, non-binary, somehow outside of the cisnormative gender binary, just like we also see expansions of people identifying with different kinds of sexual orientations that exist, outside of a narrower and normative sort of set of possibilities. And even just recently, was able to go with my partner to a small gathering in Vancouver for families of gender creative younger kids. And it was amazing to see kids, some of them, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, who were identifying in all kinds of wonderful gender creative ways. And my partner, who's non-binary, was there to speak to this group of young people and the caregivers in their lives. And they talked about how for so many years when they were a kid, all they ever knew was that you could be a boy or a girl. And this is, my partner's in their mid 30s, right? Like they just didn't have that sense that non-binary was even a possibility until they were in their 20s. So just at the most basic level, it feels really exciting to me that young folks today, just by virtue of the larger context that they're in, do get a wider and richer sense of gender possibilities. Just yesterday, we went over to our kids preschool and dropped off a big armload, a donation of all of these amazing books about gender diversity for younger children, right? Like we were like, here you go. Shout out to Iron Dog in Vancouver for supplying us with so many good books that I could then bring to our daycare, kids daycare. Um, so, I mean, I say that because I think I see that rich expansion of possibilities, just as I also see it in older adults in my life, people at different points in their age trajectory who are coming into new realizations around their gender identities as they're seeing different possibilities open up in front of them. And I think that's amazing, right? At whatever life stage it happens for folks. And we simultaneously see a really organized backlash, right? Which is very much about that entanglement of white supremacy, fascism, and these kinds of political movements that are really trying to push back against this expansion of possibilities, right? And so I think it's important to name that and the kind of violence and targeting that's happening, particularly for trans young people right now. And so I see that as being such an important space, certainly for adults like me and cis people like me, to be like, okay, how can I fight back? And who can I learn from? And how can I be in that rich everyday practice of solidarity? At a really, simple kind of, simple in the sense that maybe it's happening in the smaller scale of my family life. We do gender open parenting. So we intentionally didn't assign a gender when any of our kids were born. We didn't have anybody announce, it's a fill in the blank when the baby came out of someone's body, right? We just are like, it's a baby. And we're going to use they, them pronouns until this kid gets old enough to tell us who they want to be. And then if it changes at some point, great, and if it changes again, great. And so that's what we've done. And with our older kiddo, just before she was around 3, she was very clear to us. She said, I'm a she, I'm a girl. We're like, great. And we talk with her about names like being kind of, I think of them as like a gift that's lovingly given and can be lovingly returned. Like my partner has used a different name from their birth name for many years, and they legally changed their name earlier this year. And we had like a name party for them. So, our kid was so excited because we had like a chocolate cake and a banner and party hats. And so I hope that she's and our younger kids as well are being raised in a context where they know they can grow up to be whoever they want to be, and that can be fluid and change at whatever point throughout their life trajectories. I think at a broader level, when I think about that at the scale of my local community, because I live in unceded Quechan territories now in Duncan, like it's the school trustee election is happening right now. And we know that there are some school trustees that are explicitly organizing around, basically being anti-SOGI. They're overtly homophobic, they're overtly transphobic. So within our queer and trans community locally, it's like, okay, we're researching the candidates. We're helping to organize some of the people in our local circles to make sure folks are getting out and voting for the supportive candidates. So I'm trying to think about that as like a really practical, kind of tangible thing that's happening. But I also think we can look to groups like Interrupting Criminalization, which is a really fabulous abolition-focused group in the US. They put out an excellent brief called We Must Fight in Solidarity with Trans Youth, drawing the connections between our movements. And I mention it because they really actively look at all of these intersecting movements that I think fundamentally are about limiting the bodily autonomy of so many people, trans folks, disabled folks, racialized folks, poor folks, so as to serve this white supremacist fascist agenda. And so how do we actually fight back against that? How do we fight that criminalization? How do we fight those efforts to limit bodily autonomy and fundamentally create conditions where all people can flourish, and certainly where young people have all of the space and support that they need to grow into the fullness of whoever they want to be without anybody but them telling them who they get to be.
That's really amazing. I always think how, yeah, it's such a good conversation to have because, like, me as a kid, I never erased the fact that I grew up as a little girl, and that was just, so much of but it was in very much you know, free way of doing that. And I did go through, like, when I was 5 or 4 or something like that, I went through those phases of being like, I think I'm a boy, like saying that to my mom, of being like, I think I'm a boy. And, being able to have those conversations as a kid. And, the name changing thing, and me saying that my dead name at the time was a boy's name and it was fine. And, and I could have totally done that transition and at that age and worked through that. There definitely is, though, it was never about how I was raised in my home. It was always different communities I was in that ended up crushing a lot of that. I was very gender nonconforming in a way, even if I was like, oh yeah, I'm a girl and I have this name. It was very gender nonconforming my entire life until, I hit certain ages where I really did get affected by peers around me and society's norms. And I went through those phases of thinking, oh, I have to be feminine now and I have to full on be a girl. And then I dropped out of school again and went full on non-binary and then trans because I was like, oh, it's school. Yeah.
Yeah. Phew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard when you are, and it's a genetic thing in our family, but to go through puberty so young,
Yeah.
like 9.5, and have the world. Like, that's when it hit me, when you started telling me that you didn't want to, you were this feisty kid who went topless constantly and ran and played with everybody of all ages, or felt safe on the drive to walk by yourself. And then all of a sudden you were like, I don't like the way I'm looked at. I don't like the way I'm sexualized. And the fact that you could articulate it was incredible, but it was also
the adults telling me that I've grown so much more than my other friends.
So curvaceous, and it was just
grown
like
so much. They're not talking about height, and it's like
barf.
Because I was, developing faster than everyone else, and that really shut down my feeling of, I'm not allowed to be anything but a girl.
Yeah,
like that definitely shut that down. And I know you've dealt with that too in your childhood, and
yeah, Liam's helped me a lot too. Like, I love that idea, like we're always becoming, right? And that it's, but the dominant narrative is to, things are fixed and rigid and stuck, and
yeah. And I mean, my eldest brother also has been a pretty good influence as him as a child.
Yeah,
being very flamboyant and
but
still being really comfortable in the fact that he's a boy and cis and like that's even important, right?
Pushing the gender boundaries and just
feeling comfortable enough in who you are and feeling that you can push that. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, so I just love all the work like, it is your generation and the one before and the one before that, and like you said, you with your altar at the beginning, you had them on your and I think that's so important to weave the past into the present, because it's never, nothing's done in silo. But also, like, the younger generation, like, I'm learning so much from the Gen Zs around me, and I was able to, I think it was, I can't remember, I think 2020, through working with Liam and his friends, I realized that I'm non-binary and always have been. And but I felt, I'm 56. Like, I had a lot of internalized yuckiness around abandoning, feminism or something. I don't know. I had to do some really deep work.
I mean, when I came out, and we did realize quite a bit of TERFs that were around us. Even if they weren't out about it, it was... Yeah, that definitely appeared when I started doing my process of going on testosterone. Right. And so then I think seeing that, you got a little more, I can't come out.
Yeah, not to throw anyone in the train, but it wasn't just heteronormative people who were TERFs to Liam. Like, it felt, because Liam was first a lesbian, and I mean, this is a big conversation, and I've never said this on air, but I want to say it. If you are a cis woman out there and you are unsure what TERF is or your own feelings, like, reach out to me. Like, I will be in solidarity for all my trans kin and friends and community as someone who will listen to you before you go do something shitty. So, and also, Zena, thank you for your work. We're just talking.
I'm just delightedly listening, so I'm into it. And I'm really sorry that you had that experience, And I mean, I think both of you had that experience of being met with that kind of prejudice, hatred, judgment, exclusion, whatever shape it took in the context of those intimate and community relationships, like during really important moments of like becoming, right? When of course, like what I want for everyone in those moments is to be met with care and celebration, and I know I didn't answer the question you asked earlier. I realized in hindsight about how I define care.
Oh, yeah.
And I think about it, maybe as a process, as an ongoing act of weaving, right? That it is this active thing that we do, that happens in relationship, that happens in communities. And, I think about my friend Hill Malatino has this amazing book called Trans Care. And it's this really interesting kind of take on care ethics, which comes out of the realm of philosophy, but very much rooted in Hill's own experiences of transness and being really rooted in in more kind of do it yourself and radical and just communities of people who've experienced all kinds of trauma and have had to learn how to care for each other. And it's through Hill that I learned about this concept of an infrapolitical ethics of care, which is maybe just sort of a fancy way of talking about like the kind of care that gets forged in the breaks and in the chasms that exist in the context of the systems that are meant to care for us and don't, and or often actively harm us. Like, how do we learn to care for each other? How do we learn to care for each other and ourselves in sustainable and ongoing ways, including when it's really hard. So yeah, just to say, like, it's maybe not the fullest definition, but I think it really is one about an active process and an ongoing process of weaving, not a singular sort of static thing we can hold to and kind of lift up, because it's so deeply situated and local and relational and both individual and also kind of collective and interdependent.
Oh, I love that. That is beautiful.
Yeah.
Thanks
that's a
for
good
answering
answer.
it. I was gonna I am a deer in a headlight, but I also always appreciate it because I always end up weaving together a new story. But it's all connected. It's all it usually all comes back to the core stuff. But so thank you for taking that big word on. That big definition of a big concept really is what we're asking, pinning it down. So this is like something I saw in your larger bio that I would like, that just I don't know, it's just something I really want to talk to you about because it's like it really connected to I don't know, the ways that I found thriving and in the everyday, and thrivistance, which is our platform kind of word for resisting while thriving, thriving while resisting. And that is that you were a go-go dancer for a queer punk band. So like you brought together two of my favorite things, punk and dancing. So yeah, I just want to hear a bit about that and just some of the ways you cultivate thriving in the everyday.
Well, my trajectory into queer punk go-go dancing, which is not a current practice of mine, but it actually has its deepest origins at Continental Coffee on Commercial Drive, probably maybe around 20 years ago. I feel like it's about the right time frame because that was actually the place where I met my dear friend Michael V. Smith, who's a queer writer. At the time, especially, was doing a lot of drag performance. And I always joke that Michael was like my gateway friend into the queer community in Vancouver that kind of became, that sort of core home for me. And at the time, there was a really amazing queer punk band in Vancouver called the Skin Jobs. Kim Kinnikin was fronting the band, and Kim now is doing some really amazing archival work, like actually documenting that particular moment of queer punk in this history of Vancouver and history of BC. And they had go-go dancers, and as go-go dancers, we would have, it was a very Blade Runner replicant inspired sort of makeup look. So we would have like black, kind of bands drawn across our eyes like the replicants did. And basically I just kind of got recruited to dance with the Skin Jobs. And so there was a mix of drag queens and queer femmes like Amber Dawn and Trish Kelly, and Darlene, the ambassador's wife, were the others that I remember from that particular moment in time. And it was, yeah, such a really joyful experience to, especially in such an early moment of my queerness and like just coming into my identity as a queer person, just coming into my identity as a queer femme, and to be able to feel so powerful in that particular kind of queer identity for me. Yeah, so that was really joyful and fun and led me on, I think a pathway where some of us also started co-organizing dance parties that we used to have at the Wise Hall for years called the Oddball. I don't know if you ever made it to one of those, Carla. I still miss those parties. May they rest in peace. So for many years, I would say, more willing to stay up really late. And I still am willing to stay up really late sometimes, but it's funny, like when I think about how do I cultivate thrive-sistance in my everyday life, honestly, one of them is actually getting enough sleep every night and just really embracing how much I love going to bed early and how much I love waking up early. And so now, if I'm going to stay up super late, I'm going to be doing something really fun, or my children will be keeping me awake. But if it's going to be about a consensual, joyful act, it's happening more infrequently, and I'm doing something really awesome. But most of the time, I'm like tucked in my bed at 8:30, reading a book for an hour. I'm so happy because then I fall asleep, and then I wake up in the morning before anybody else in my house is awake, which also is how I cultivate thrive-sistance, because I make a coffee and I read and I think and I write, because I am someone who I love to learn and I love to read and I love to write, and that is just such an ongoing practice for me. And I love the quiet of the beginning of the day. It feels like the best time when I can tap into my creativity. I wrote so much of the Care We Dream Of, like in the early mornings. Um, and I'm continually taking little kinds of courses, and just finding other ways, again, to keep learning and unlearning, right? In that really self-directed sort of way. It's never toward a particular kind of credential, unless I'm going off and doing something like a death doula training. It's more because I'm perennially curious. So I feel like that's really important. And I also feel like it's really about continuing to feel in a really embodied way, like what are my boundaries, and how can I be in relationship and be offering what I have from a place that feels really energizing and resourced, as opposed to what I did a lot more when I was younger and still do sometimes, which was give from a place of depletion or from a place that actually didn't really feel consensual to me, in the sense that I wasn't always in a consent-based conversation with myself about what I couldn't give. I felt like my worth was dictated by my ability to give or my ability to care for others. And that didn't always lead to the most kind of sustainable and reciprocal kinds of dynamics. So that boundary work, I feel like, is really important, and it allows me to give from a place of like true, rich, and full sustainability and energy. And I think also in these particular times, like letting myself grieve, and just sit with like the hard things and the bigness, of this particular ongoing unfolding moment that we're in, whether it's the collective trauma of the pandemic, whether it's climate catastrophe, whether it's the rise of fascism. Like these are all big things that are happening in our world, and that feel kind of acutely scary to me sometimes, as someone who's in a really important parenting relationship with 3 really young people. And I think a lot about the kinds of future that they're inheriting, but also like what my responsibilities and accountabilities are to help co-create a world that is going to support them and other young people to flourish as much as possible, but also feel equipped to like be interdependent and care for one another, and resist and fight back, against the forces that continue to create these conditions. And I think also to find space for play, and joy. And like that's something I love so much about being in relationship with my kids. Like I'm a really silly, goofy person, and not everyone gets to see that side of me. Like there's nothing like living with a 4.5-year-old to make you just an artisan of the fart joke, And I really feel like just being able to be so silly and ridiculous with my kids in ways that like leave both of us. I mean, especially with our older kid, again, it's different with the babies, but with our older kids, like we just laugh and play a lot in ways that feel, I think, really fun for all of us. And that feels like such a space of joy for me.
That's amazing. That's so, yeah, feels so real. It's very similar to.
Yeah, I love that you
our lives.
weaved in boundaries and like that thriving, like if we're not going internal and dealing with and being with the grief and being with all the messiness of life, that it's hard to really cultivate thriving. Like it becomes shallow. You just seem to weave that all in beautifully. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. That is also your answers. Weaves well into the next question as well. How we are grounding the season in the ideas and action around trust, and how to grow trust in ourselves, in how we make art and create, and in how we connect with others, etc. And trust seems to be central in all you do. So, with that, how does trust animate your life?
When I think about how trust animates my life, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is like asking the question of, for myself certainly, like what does it mean to trust? And I think especially to be trustworthy, right? And to not look at either of those things as static states or like a sort of one and done thing, right? Like, oh, Carla, you trust me, right? Like you just trust me forever. That's how we're going to now interact with each other, right? That's how trust works. Yet I feel like sometimes, we maybe can be taught to think about trust as something that just kind of happens once and then exists in the same form forever. And so I like thinking about trust as something active, trust as something that is alive and ongoing, and that's profoundly relational, right? So some of that is about my own trust in myself, right? Like that relationship can be with self, like whether that's around boundaries, listening to my intuition, holding myself accountable, right, to my own values and what integrity looks like for me. Because I ask myself that question a lot, like, how can I be in my integrity? Like, what do I want to say yes to? What do I want to say no to? And then I think to have that kind of important outer ring of relationships of people that I also trust to hold me accountable for those kinds of ethics and values litmus tests, that I can go to and say, hey, help me think my way through this or feel my way through this both, so that I can actually continue showing up in ways where that earned trust continues to be earned and deepened. And I say that I think because something that I attune to a lot in the work that I do as a writer, as someone that has some kind of public profile in the work that I do, is it's easy for me, particularly as a white cis woman with a PhD, to be lifted up as a particular kind of expert. And I think in a culture of, influencers and celebrity culture, I'm not at any sort of like big scale in that regard, but there absolutely are times when I intentionally need to say no to things, even if it might give me a little bit of the brightness of that spotlight on me, because it's not actually in my integrity, right? And it's not actually about rooting in that trust and in the relationships and accountabilities that are the most profoundly important to me. So I think that's an important piece. And I think also showing up, like even just at the micro scale today, like I have a friend who's sick with COVID, and I wanted to make sure that I was checking in with that friend by text message today and, doing a little bit of research for them so they don't have to, so they get some tips on symptom management. Or another friend who I know is grieving and like making sure to reach out to that person and see how they're feeling, because I know that they're in a bit of the thick of their grief right now. And like just thinking about again those everyday practices of care, those everyday practices of relationality, and like when I say I'm going to do something, I do it. And if I can't, I be honest about that and accountable about it too, right? So yeah, just trying to think about that. Trust as something alive, trust as something active, trust as something that's deeply relational.
That's such a great answer to that. Yeah.
Aw.
I love that.
We're just
So
like
sweet.
swooning over here.
It's so sweet. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's foundational.
Mm-hmm.
But it is emergent and it is consensual and it's always in motion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, beautifully said. And it is completely connected to how we show up. I love that.
Definitely, yeah.
We're just winding up with the final two questions. Are you okay? I know you had only till 4, so thanks so much. I knew it was going to be a longer one. Yeah, so we have a lot of young people who listen to the show, and particularly because of Uli, a lot of LGBTQ plus youth. And so I'm just curious, you can recommend anything you want, but I'm also just curious about recommending some resources, whether it's books, podcasts, and all that stuff for folks who are, trying to get the care they need. And I mean care in the larger way you define it, but also like concrete care.
Yeah, I mean, definitely want to say hi, Team Uli, and just like beam a great bunch of like my own queer femme love like out to the LGBTQ plus and queer and trans folks and younger people listening. I really feel like such joy and yeah, like just such a sense of deep solidarity with younger people and certainly with LGBTQ plus younger people. Like know that you have an ally in me for sure, in the sense of someone who hopefully and an accomplice, critically, someone who will be gay and do crimes with and for you as required. And I also will say that recommending books and podcasts is most definitely one of my love languages, and so it will take a great deal of self-restraint for me to not give you like a 40 item short list. I may send you some things as a follow-up in an email that you could put in the show notes for like the deep cuts, but I'll try to give you like the singles for now. So, I mean, I would say, definitely a couple of them I've mentioned already, because I feel like learning about disability justice has just been so profoundly transformative for me, including in how I understand and relate to concepts like health, healing, care. So, Leah Lakshmi Pyapna-Samarsinha's books, Care Work and The Future is Disabled, like actually it's today is the publication day for The Future of Disabled, and it's just so good. I was able to scoop an early copy because we have the same publisher. I also really want to shout out an incredible podcast that was done by Megan Linton, who's based in Ottawa, actually, and is a queer disabled researcher and activist. It's called Invisible Institutions, and it's a brilliant, brilliant podcast that looks at historically and contemporarily at institutions in Canada for people labeled with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it's richly rooted in an abolitionist praxis. And I think it's just an utterly brilliant work of journalism, but also really very much about activism. So love those. And I also really love, and mentioned it earlier, Hill Malatino's book, Trans Care. And one cool thing about it is there's actually an open access version of Trans Care. It's just a little short book, but it's about trans care practices. And if you wanted to read it for free online, you can find it, and I'll make sure to send the links along. And then I think I actually haven't had a chance to read it yet because the last time I saw it in a bookstore, it was gigantic and I was going to fly home on a float plane and I didn't think I could carry home a book quite so big. However, I'm very excited about the second edition of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves that was recently published. So for trans folks in particular, that could be a really amazing resource that was created by and for trans community about different aspects of trans health. So I think that could be a really cool place to go to. And I think another place that I would speak to just as another and kind of important area that's been really important for me in my own learning and unlearning process is like, how do we learn our histories and different histories of care, where care has meant activism and community organizing. So there's a historian named Jules Gill Peterson, who's originally from Vancouver, and is based in the US now, who I think is just like a brilliant genius. She's a brown trans woman historian, fabulous thinker and activist. She just put out a new article today, which I made sure to read before this interview because it was so good and I knew it would be relevant. That's all about the history of trans DIY healthcare and this kind of care organizing that has happened in communities dating back to like the 50s and before, where trans folks and especially trans women have been like, fuck your gatekeeping. We're going to get our own hormones. We're going to do some of our own surgeries. Like we're actually going to do care by and for our communities outside of the medical system and the medical industrial complex, often in spite of that system. So I think looking to the work of folks like Jules, there's a really interesting book by Katie Batza. It's kind of academic, but I found it really illuminating. And Dean Spade was the one who pointed it to me through his mutual aid syllabus. It's called Before AIDS, Gay Health Politics in the 1970s. And the reason I mention it is it was this moment of this kind of coalitional organizing where in some cases, folks were working in solidarities with like the Black liberation movement, for example, the Young Lords and the movement for Puerto Rican liberation. There were these really interesting intersections in that moment around the disability rights movement at the time, Black Power, the women's movement, and really in this like, I think this kind of rich context of like care as activism, care as resistance. We saw it in groups like the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, for example. So I think all of those could be really rich starting places. And there's literally like 20 more things I could recommend. And I will stop talking because I could go on forever.
Oh, I
That's
know.
amazing.
When I get asked this, I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
go on just a rant
Yeah.
forever.
That's a wonderful list, though. I'm like taking notes for myself. I'm really
Yeah.
excited about that art essay that came out today. I'm really into the importance of not erasing the stories and the heroes that came before. And most of those stories, so many of those stories, especially but from BIPOC or disabled peoples and LGBT plus folks, like were silenced and buried. It wasn't like they weren't there. And so I just, my big part of my praxis has always been about finding those stories and lifting them up. So thank you for that one. I'm going to go dig into that. Yeah.
And now, with the last question, it's just a quick little thing of asking if you are able to tell folks how they can connect with you and your work.
Yeah, what's the best way and all that. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, one way folks can find me is through my website, which is just zenasharman.com. And something specific that I really love doing is I send out a newsletter the last Friday of every month, which is like kind of just like a letter to folks. And it always includes recommendations of things I've been listening to, reading, coming back to my love language of recommendations. So like my most recent newsletter was talking about this idea of like parenting as pedagogy, which I learned from Julietta Singh, or parenting as praxis. But I explore all kinds of things like death and queerness and social change and all kinds of things. So that's one place. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram. Those are the two places I'm most active. And my handle for both is just at Zena Sharman. My Instagram is locked, but that's only because I had one troll make one comment once and I was like, nope. But I will always say yes to folks who seem awesome. And, that's pretty much everybody, unless it's clear to me that they're a bot or a weird man who really just is trying to seduce me, which doesn't happen very often, which is great because, I don't need a random man from the internet sliding into my DMs.
Ew, no one does. No one does, weird men.
Sorry. I mean, like I love weirdos and I love some men. And also in my personal DMs, there's so many DMs I enthusiastically welcome. And then others I'm like,
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
definitely.
Was there anything that you feel like you missed or you would like to say before we sign off?
I know this is a very long conversation, so I'll just want to express such deep gratitude for the work that both of you are doing and creating spaces for these conversations. I'm such a big fan of the show and I listen to every episode and I always get so much out of these conversations. So just really want to say thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks for being part of this. This episode is going to be meaningful for so many folks and you're so generous and it's true. I just want to go on record that it's true that when you say you're an ally and accomplice and you'll support, like the support you provided to us, to Uliam with some of his questions about becoming a doula and just, you've just been so generous and supportive. And I want to just publicly say that because it's true. Like you're not just saying that, you do it. Yeah. So thank you so much, Zena. Thanks for everything you bring and do and are. And it was just such a joy.
Yeah, really great. Thanks for listening to our show. Grounded Futures is a media production and mentorship collaborative, and this podcast is produced by Carla Bergman, Uliam Joy, Jamie Lee Gonzalez, and Melissa Sharp, and our sound tech is by Chris Bergman.
Resources and transcripts for this episode are in the show notes. If you want to donate some funds or check out our other awesome shows, head over to groundedfutures.com or email us with comments and suggestions at groundedfutures@gmail.com. And please tune in next time to hear more from our incredible guests on how to thrive in the everyday.